The wind howled through the narrow alleyways of the old village, rustling the tattered curtains in Karam Din's modest home. The walls of his house, though worn with time, stood as a testament to the years of struggle and sacrifice he had endured. At 70, Karam Din was a man of quiet dignity, his back slightly bent by the weight of years but his heart still full of resilience. His face bore the marks of time, deep lines etched into his weathered skin, each telling a story of hardship, love, and loss. But despite the many storms life had thrown his way, Karam Din had always found solace in one thing: his family. More than anything, he had cherished his late son, Arson, who had been the light of his life. Arson had left this world too soon, leaving behind a young widow, Sakeena, and a small child, little Ibrahim, who had barely learned to walk when tragedy struck. Karam Din had taken it upon himself to care for them, for they were now his only reason to keep going. Sakeena was like a daughter to him. He trusted her with everything, believing in her kindness, her loyalty, and her unwavering devotion to his grandson. Yet, there was something unsettling about the air in his house these days. A strange shift in the atmosphere, like the whisper of a secret waiting to be unraveled. Sakeena was a woman of few words. Since Arson's passing, she had withdrawn into herself, speaking only when necessary. She kept her eyes downcast, her movements careful and controlled, as though carrying a burden too heavy to share. But Karam Din never questioned her grief. He knew loss well enough to understand that it did not always demand words. It lived in the quiet moments, in the silent sobs behind closed doors, in the way a person carried themselves when no one was looking. Yet, in recent weeks, Karam Din had noticed peculiar things. Sakeena had grown more secretive. She would often leave the house at odd hours, returning only after sunset, her expression unreadable. When he asked where she had been, she would murmur something vague: a trip to the market, a visit to the tailor, a walk to clear her head. Little Ibrahim, who had once clung to her, now hesitated in her presence. He would cry out for his grandfather in the middle of the night, his small voice trembling with fear. Karam Din's heart ached at the change, but he pushed the unease aside. Perhaps it was just grief taking its toll. Perhaps Sakeena was merely struggling to find her place in a world that had been cruelly ripped apart. Or perhaps there was something more. One evening, as Karam Din sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he heard a noise, a faint rustling from the courtyard. He turned his head sharply. The evening shadows played tricks on his aging eyes, but he could have sworn he saw a figure darting past the side of the house. He stood up, gripping his wooden cane tightly, and shuffled toward the source of the sound. The gate creaked slightly as he pushed it open, his heartbeat steady but alert. His gaze swept across the yard, searching for anything amiss. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure slipped into the shadows behind the old shed. Karam Din's breath hitched. It was not Sakeena. The person was taller, broader. A man. His fingers clenched around his cane. His mind raced. Who would dare enter his home in secrecy? Was it a thief? A stranger lurking in the night? Or someone who did not fear being caught? Karam Din took a step forward, but before he could call out, the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness beyond the walls of his home. That night, sleep eluded Karam Din. He lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling, his mind restless with unanswered questions. The village was small, and word traveled fast. If a stranger had been sneaking around, surely someone would have spoken of it. But no such whispers had reached his ears. He turned his thoughts to Sakeena. Was she aware of this? Had she seen anything unusual? Should he ask her? A part of him hesitated. Sakeena had always been respectful, dutiful. She had mourned his son with sincerity, had taken care of Ibrahim with patience. Why, then, did this sudden fear creep into his bones? His thoughts spiraled deeper into doubt. What if the figure he saw was not an intruder? What if it was someone who belonged here? And if that was the case, why was it being hidden from him? The next morning, as Karam Din sat sipping his tea, little Ibrahim toddled toward him, his tiny fingers gripping something shiny. The old man smiled, reaching out for his grandson, until his eyes caught sight of what the boy held. A gold bangle. His wife's bangle. The one she had gifted Sakeena on her wedding day. The one that had never left Sakeena's wrist. Karam Din's chest tightened. He looked at the child, his innocent eyes blinking up at him. "Where did you find this, Beta?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. Ibrahim pointed toward the old wooden chest in Sakeena's room. Karam Din felt a cold dread creep up his spine. If the bangle was in the chest, then why wasn't it on Sakeena's wrist? And more importantly, why had she hidden it away? Determined to get to the bottom of his suspicions, Karam Din waited for Sakeena to return from her daily errands. When she finally entered the house, her face drawn and weary, he wasted no time. "Sakeena," he called gently, watching her reaction closely. She turned to him, her dark eyes wary. "Yes, Baba." He held up the bangle. Ibrahim found this today. For the briefest moment, something flickered in her expression. Something quick, almost imperceptible. Then, just as swiftly, it was gone. She reached for the bangle, her fingers trembling slightly. "It must have slipped off," she murmured. I didn't realize." But Karam Din knew better. His wife's bangles never slipped off. And Sakeena, she was lying. For the first time since his son's passing, Karam Din felt a deep, unsettling fear grip his heart. Something was wrong. And the truth, whatever it was about to unfold. The house felt different now. Karam Din had always believed his home was a sanctuary, a place of love and security. But ever since he found the bangle hidden away, something had shifted. There was an unease in the air, an unspoken tension that gripped his heart and refused to let go. He observed Sakeena closely in the following days. She seemed more withdrawn, more restless. He noticed how she flinched at sudden noises, how her gaze darted toward the courtyard every now and then as if expecting something, or someone. And then there was Ibrahim. The child's behavior had changed too. He refused to let his mother hold him for long, often running to Karam Din instead. At night, he would wake up crying, pointing toward the shadows near the door. "Man," he whimpered one evening, burying his face in Karam Din's chest. Karam Din stroked the boy's hair gently, a frown forming on his forehead. "What man, Beta?" Ibrahim sniffled, rubbing his eyes. "The one who comes at night." A chill ran down Karam Din's spine. He glanced toward Sakeena, who had frozen at the child's words. Her hands clenched the edge of her dupatta, her knuckles turning white. That was the moment Karam Din knew. Whatever was happening in his house, his daughter-in-law was hiding something. And he had to find out what. That night, Karam Din did not sleep. He sat on the charpoy near the courtyard, his old eyes scanning the shadows, his ears tuned to the slightest noise. The lantern flickered beside him, casting eerie shapes on the mud walls. Hours passed. The village lay silent under the blanket of night, the only sound the distant howl of a stray dog. Then, just as his eyelids began to grow heavy, he heard it. A faint creak. The sound of the back gate opening. Karam Din's heart pounded in his chest. He tightened his grip on his cane and slowly, carefully, rose to his feet. Moving with the stealth of a man much younger, he made his way toward the courtyard, staying in the shadows. And then he saw her. Sakeena, wrapped in a dark shawl, slipping out of the gate. Karam Din's breath caught. His mind reeled. Where was she going at this hour? And more importantly, why was she sneaking out like a thief? With determination burning in his veins, Karam Din followed. His feet moved cautiously over the uneven path, careful not to make a sound. The village lay in slumber, but the moon cast a dim glow, illuminating Sakeena's every step. She moved quickly, her shawl pulled tight around her, glancing over her shoulder every now and then. Was she expecting someone? Or was she afraid of being followed? Karam Din's throat tightened. What was she involved in? After a short walk, she reached an old abandoned hut on the outskirts of the village. Karam Din watched from behind a tree as she hesitated at the door. Then, with a deep breath, she pushed it open and stepped inside. Seconds later, a man's voice emerged from within. Karam Din felt his blood run cold. He crept closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. Pressing his back against the wall of the hut, he listened. You took too long, the voice inside muttered, impatient and rough. I couldn't leave earlier. Sakeena's voice came next, quieter, trembling. There was a pause. Then, the man spoke again. Did you bring it? Karam Din's breath hitched. Not yet, Sakeena whispered. I need more time. A sharp exhale. A sound of frustration. Then a chilling reply. You're running out of time, Sakeena. Silence stretched between them. Karam Din's mind raced. Who was this man? What did Sakeena need more time for? And why did her voice tremble with fear? Karam Din knew he had to get out of there before he was caught. He turned away, his mind heavy with questions. Slowly, he retraced his steps, careful not to make a sound. When he finally reached home, his hands were trembling. He sat down on the porch, staring blankly at the courtyard. His thoughts spiraled into a storm of suspicion and disbelief. Sakeena, the woman he had trusted like his own daughter, was lying to him. But why? And who was that man? Karam Din felt something deep in his gut. Something painful, something terrifying. The truth was near. And he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Karam Din barely slept that night. His old bones ached from exhaustion, but his mind refused to rest. The image of Sakeena sneaking out, the voice of the unknown man, and her trembling whispers haunted him like a nightmare. As the first light of dawn seeped through the sky, he sat motionless on the porch, his thoughts in turmoil. He had spent years trusting Sakeena, treating her as his own blood. Had he been blind? Had she been deceiving him all along? A bitter wind blew through the courtyard. Karam Din pulled his shawl tighter around his frail shoulders. He knew he couldn't ignore this. He had to confront her. But not yet. He needed to know the full truth first. And for that, he had to be patient. That afternoon, as Karam Din walked toward the village bazaar, he noticed something unusual. A man stood near the tea stall, his back partially turned. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a worn-out shalwar kameez. His presence felt oddly familiar. Karam Din slowed his steps, carefully observing the man's movements. He was speaking in hushed tones with another villager, his expression tense. A deep unease settled in Karam Din's chest. Then, as if sensing his gaze, the man turned slightly, just enough for Karam Din to see his face. Karam Din froze. It was him. The same voice from last night. The man who had been speaking to Sakeena. A dark suspicion took root in his mind. He had to find out who this man was. Karam Din approached the tea stall, his steps measured. The villager the man had been speaking to had walked away, leaving the stranger alone. Karam Din cleared his throat. Salam, Beta. The man turned to him, his expression unreadable. Wa alaikum salam. You are new in this village? Karam Din asked, keeping his tone light. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking his head. I've been around. Karam Din nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the man's face. I don't recall seeing you before. A shadow flickered across the man's eyes. I keep to myself. There was something unsettling about his demeanor. He wasn't just any traveler. He was hiding something. Karam Din took a step closer. Are you looking for someone? Beta. The man's jaw clenched. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Karam Din watched him go, his hands tightening into fists. Who was he? And what did he want from Sakeena? That evening, Karam Din made a decision. He needed to search Sakeena's room. After dinner, once Sakeena had put Ibrahim to sleep, she stepped out to fetch water from the well. Karam Din seized the moment. He entered her small, neatly kept room, his heart pounding. He wasn't proud of what he was doing, but he had no choice. If Sakeena was in trouble, he needed to know. He searched through her trunk, carefully shifting clothes and belongings. His fingers brushed against something unusual. Paper. A folded letter, hidden beneath layers of fabric. With trembling hands, he opened it. As his eyes scanned the words, his breath caught in his throat. Sakeena, you cannot avoid this any longer. You know what you owe. If you don't bring the money soon, there will be consequences. I will come again. There was no name, no signature. Just a warning. A threat. Karam Din's head spun. Money? Debt? What had Sakeena gotten herself into? Footsteps approached. He quickly folded the letter and placed it back, shutting the trunk just as Sakeena entered. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if sensing something was off. Baba, do you need anything? Karam Din forced a smile. No, Beta. Just checking if Ibrahim's blanket was here. Sakeena nodded but didn't look convinced. Karam Din walked past her, his mind racing. He now had proof that something was terribly wrong. But the biggest question remained. Who was this man? And what debt was Sakeena hiding? The next day, Karam Din decided to keep a closer watch on Sakeena. He noticed how she avoided eye contact, how she seemed more nervous than usual. He could see the weight of something pressing heavily on her. Finally, that evening, he broke his silence. Sakeena, he said gently, as they sat in the courtyard. Is there something you need to tell me? Sakeena's hands stilled over her sewing. What do you mean, Baba? Karam Din took a deep breath. I know you have been meeting someone in secret. I know about the letter. Her face turned pale. She lowered her head, gripping the fabric in her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Sakeena, he pressed, his voice firm yet kind. Who is he? Tears welled in her eyes. Her lips quivered as she spoke. He is my past. Baba. Karam Din's heart clenched. What do you mean? He whispered. She took a deep, shuddering breath. And then, the truth spilled from her lips. He is my husband. Karam Din felt the world tilt beneath him. His hands trembled. His ears rang with disbelief. Her husband? But Arson, his son, was her husband. His son had died. She was a widow. Then who was this man? Sakeena looked at him with pleading eyes. Baba, I never told anyone. Because I was ashamed. Before I married Arson, my family forced me into a marriage with a cruel man. A man who abandoned me when I was only 18. Karam Din's blood turned cold. I never saw him again. Until now. Sakeena wiped her tears. He found me, Baba. He knows about my past. He is threatening me. He says I still belong to him. He wants money. Or he will take Ibrahim. Karam Din's vision blurred with rage. His body shook with anger and sorrow. His grandson. His innocent, helpless grandson. Now, he understood the fear in Sakeena's eyes. The desperation. The secrecy. She wasn't a betrayer. She was a prisoner. And that man, who had come back from the shadows of her past, was ready to destroy everything. Karam Din's fists clenched. His voice was steady, but it burned with determination. No one will take my grandson away. The truth had unfolded. But the battle had just begun. Karam Din sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. The weight of Sakeena's revelation pressed down on him like a mountain. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with fury. This man, this ghost from Sakeena's past, had returned not just to torment her but to take away Ibrahim. Karam Din looked at his grandson, sleeping soundly in the corner of the dimly lit room. The boy's tiny chest rose and fell with each peaceful breath. No. No one would take him away. He turned to Sakeena, who sat with her face buried in her hands. Her body shook with silent sobs. Beta, Karam Din's voice was steady, though his heart thundered in his chest. How long has he been threatening you? Sakeena wiped her tears, her voice barely above a whisper. A few weeks. At first, I thought he would leave if I ignored him. But he comes back. Each time more aggressive. More demanding. Karam Din's jaw clenched. Did he hurt you? Sakeena hesitated, then slowly rolled up her sleeve. Dark bruises. The sight sent a storm of rage through Karam Din's veins. He gritted his teeth, swallowing the fire rising inside him. He said if I don't pay him, he will take Ibrahim. Her voice cracked, her entire body trembling. Baba, I don't have the money. I never did. Karam Din placed a firm hand over hers. You are not alone in this. Beta. Sakeena looked up, her swollen eyes filled with despair. I won't let him lay a finger on my grandson. Karam Din vowed, his voice a whisper of steel. This ends now. Karam Din had always been a man of reason, but this situation left no room for patience. He had to act before it was too late. The next morning, he made his way to the village mosque, seeking counsel from the imam. The elder listened intently as Karam Din explained the dire situation. This man, Karam Din said, his voice tight with anger, he has no right to claim my grandson. Sakeena was forced into that marriage. And that man abandoned her. In the eyes of God, their union is broken. The imam nodded solemnly. Legally and religiously, she is not his wife anymore. But men like him do not care for laws. Karam Din's fists clenched. Then what can I do? I cannot let him take my grandson. The imam's expression darkened. If he is making threats, you must go to the authorities. Karam Din shook his head. The authorities? You know how they are. They will do nothing until something terrible happens. The imam sighed. Then there is only one option left. My friend. Karam Din's eyes narrowed. What is it? The imam leaned in, his voice low. You must confront him. Not as an old man pleading for his family, but as a father who will not be broken. That evening, Karam Din waited. He knew the man would come. He had watched Sakeena glance fearfully toward the gate all day, her shoulders tense with anticipation. She knew, just as Karam Din did, that the storm was near. And then, as the sky darkened, the inevitable happened. A heavy knock on the door. Sakeena flinched. Karam Din rose to his feet, his old bones aching, but his spirit unyielding. He motioned for Sakeena to stay inside with Ibrahim. Then, he opened the door. There he stood, the man from the shadows. His face was rugged, his stance casual yet threatening. The smirk on his lips sent a chill through Karam Din's spine. You've wasted enough time, old man, the man said, stepping forward. Where's my wife? And where's my son? Karam Din blocked the entrance. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, locked onto the man's. She is not your wife, Karam Din said, his voice unwavering. And Ibrahim is not your son. The man's smirk disappeared. Move aside, old man. Karam Din did not flinch. The man stepped closer, his voice a whisper of menace. I don't have time for this. I want what's mine. Karam Din's anger surged. She was never yours. And you know it. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the man's expression twisted with rage. You think you can stop me? Karam Din's voice was steady. Yes. The man's fists tightened. I can make this easy for you, old man. Or I can make it painful. Karam Din did not waver. You think I fear pain? I have lost a son. I have buried my own blood. I know pain better than you ever will. The man sneered. Then prepare to lose something else. He lunged forward. But before he could lay a hand on Karam Din, a sharp cry pierced the air. Stop! Sakeena stood behind Karam Din, her face streaked with tears, but her stance firm. She stepped forward, shaking but resolute. No more, she said, her voice trembling yet powerful. You will not control me anymore. The man's eyes darkened. You have no choice. Sakeena clenched her fists. I do have a choice. And I choose to fight. Karam Din's chest swelled with pride. The man scoffed. You think you can fight me? A weak widow and an old man. Sakeena's gaze burned with fury. We are not alone. The man frowned. What? Suddenly, footsteps echoed. From the shadows, villagers emerged. Men from the mosque, neighbors, even the imam. They stood behind Karam Din and Sakeena, their eyes filled with silent resolve. The man's confidence wavered. You have no place here, the imam said, stepping forward. Leave, before this gets worse for you. The man looked around, realizing he was outnumbered. His jaw tightened, but he knew he had lost. He took a step back, his lips curling in frustration. This isn't over. Karam Din held his gaze. Yes, it is. For a long moment, they stood locked in a silent battle. Then, with a sharp glare, the man turned and disappeared into the night. The tension broke. Sakeena let out a choked sob, and Karam Din pulled her into a fierce embrace. Ibrahim stirred from his sleep, unaware that his fate had just been saved. The villagers nodded to Karam Din before dispersing, their silent support a reminder that in the face of darkness, family and community would always prevail. But deep inside, Karam Din knew. This battle was over. But the war was not. The man would return. And Karam Din would be ready. The night was still, but inside Karam Din's heart, a storm raged. Though the man had left, Karam Din knew this was not the end. A predator never retreats unless it's planning to strike again. And Karam Din would not wait for that moment. The morning sun rose over the village, casting golden rays over the mud-brick houses. But there was no peace in Karam Din's home. Sakeena sat beside Ibrahim, who was playing with a wooden toy, blissfully unaware of the battle surrounding his fate. She had barely slept, fear evident in the dark circles under her eyes. "Baba," she said hesitantly, "what do we do now?" Karam Din placed a reassuring hand on hers. "We fight, Beta. But we fight with wisdom, not fear." Sakeena swallowed hard. "You think he'll come back?" Karam Din's jaw clenched. "I know he will." The Imam had advised them to seek the help of authorities, but Karam Din knew the truth. The law moved too slowly. By the time they took action, Ibrahim could already be gone. No. Karam Din would act first. Karam Din spent the day speaking to the villagers, gathering their support. Many had seen the bruises on Sakeena's arms. Some had witnessed the man lurking around, waiting for the right moment. And so, they devised a plan. That night, they waited. And as expected, the man returned. Karam Din, standing in the shadows near the gate, watched as the figure crept through the darkness. The man's posture was different this time, no longer casual, no longer cocky. Tonight, he had come to take. But Karam Din was ready. As soon as the man reached for the door, a loud whistle pierced the air. From every direction, villagers emerged from the darkness, holding lanterns, sticks, anything they could grab. Their faces were grim, their stances unyielding. The man turned, his eyes widening in shock and fury. "You set a trap," he growled. Karam Din stepped forward, his voice steady. "You were never going to walk away with my grandson." The man sneered. "You think a bunch of villagers can stop me?" The crowd did not move. The Imam's voice rang through the silence. "You have no right here. This village stands with Karam Din." The man's nostrils flared, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape. "You think this is over?" he spat, stepping back. "I'll be back. And next time, I won't come alone." Karam Din's voice was like steel. "You will never return." The man scoffed, but before he could take another step, a voice rang from behind. "Stop right there." Two policemen, alerted earlier by Karam Din, stepped out from the darkness. The man stiffened, but it was too late. Within moments, he was surrounded. One officer grabbed him, forcing his hands behind his back. "We've been looking for you," the officer muttered. "Your crimes don't end here, do they?" The man struggled, but the officers held firm. "This isn't over," he hissed at Karam Din. But for the first time, Karam Din smiled. "Yes, it is." The officers dragged him away, his threats swallowed by the night. And just like that, it was over. The weight on Sakeena's shoulders seemed to vanish as she collapsed into Karam Din's arms. Her body shook, not with fear, but with relief. The villagers patted Karam Din's back, murmuring words of support before dispersing into the night. Ibrahim, awakened by the commotion, rubbed his sleepy eyes. "Ami," he murmured. Sakeena crouched down and pulled him into a tight embrace. "I'm here, Beta. I'm here." Karam Din watched them, his heart swelling with love and protection. For the first time in months, their home was safe. The next morning, the sun felt different, warmer, brighter. Karam Din sat on the veranda, watching Ibrahim chase a butterfly. Sakeena stepped beside him, her voice soft. "Baba, I don't know how to thank you." Karam Din smiled gently. "You don't need to, Beta. A father's duty never ends." Sakeena looked down, tears brimming in her eyes. "I was so scared. I thought I was alone in this." Karam Din placed a hand over hers. "You were never alone. And you never will be. Sakeena let out a soft sob, but this time, it was one of peace. Karam Din watched his grandson, who giggled as the butterfly fluttered just beyond his reach. Ibrahim would grow up free. Free from fear. Free from his mother's past. And Karam Din would make sure of it. Always.